Greetings, friends! Juan Ingriska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of June 17th through June 23rd of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around and comment your thoughts. Alrighty, and this week we actually have a pretty significant update and also a bit of updates across the entire front, so let's get right into it. The first thing is that again, one thing about this thing about war, the term that one of the things is that a battle never survives contact with the enemy, a plan never survives contact with the enemy. Even with people who follow this war, you always think you know what's going to happen, but war has a thing, with as crazy as it is, to shock you, to tell you like, oh, something that you just did not expect happens. Like you have to be prepared for anything. And one of the biggest things that surprised me, same thing with when Avdiivka happened, was that the Russians this week, one of the biggest news of this week is that the Russians are activated in the Toretsk direction. This front has been extremely quiet basically since the war began, and the Russians have finally activated on this front. Is this a major push? Is this push just to tie Ukrainians down? We don't know yet. One thing that's been told is that the Russians exploited a troop rotation. The Ukrainians were rotating troops that were holding this line with other troops. Allegedly, the troops here, were fresh because there's obviously nothing really going on here, and they were getting replaced with troops from, I think, Chasiv Yar. And, so this weakened unit was going to go reinforce a quiet part of the front, while the fresh unit was going to go support where active clashes have been going on for months now. But during that rotation, the Russians managed to exploit that situation and break through here. And they made major breakthroughs here. And, this is very significant in terms of like the scale of like how often progress happens in this war. This is pretty significant. So the Russians activated kind of in the more northern part of this area right here along the Gorlovka-Toretsk 2014 line and managed to basically break through here and capture the village of Shumy. And more importantly, according to most sources, the Russians have captured a mini hill right here. Capturing these cemetery and this hill kind of gives them a overlooking position of Ukrainians who are in the village of Zelyzyanya and Pishimnia here. Apologies for my words. I will butcher the hell out of foreign languages. So the Ukrainians could try to make a counterattack because Shumy is just a regular village. But now that they capture this hill, the Russians have a better chance of defending their gains in Shumy and entering the village of Pshinia and Druzhba here. Now, Toretsk is probably one of the main goals, but Toretsk is huge. Toretsk has lots of landfills. You could see them here. You could see these high-rise buildings. You could see these hills here. This is like Avdiivka, but like even more so. So there's a lot of things, and I don't think the Russians are going to attack Toretsk directly. I think right now it looks like this is just another pinning operation to drag Ukrainian troops, away from Chasiv Yar or Avdiivka. One thing this does confirm to me is that I think the goal of the Russians is this direction, this Donetsk, Bakhmut direction, this area right here. And I think, they're focusing on Chasiv Yar. They're going to focus on moving northwest here, and, they're going to continue pushing the Ukrainians away from Donetsk here. But they're going to start moving towards, this area right here, this land, between the highway and to the west of Toretsk. They're going to try to push through here. They're going to try to push, towards Chasiv Yar and obviously secure it. And then try to, obviously to take Chasiv Yar, they're going to have to secure the southern part of Chasiv Yar. And, once this happens, I think one of the big goals of the Russians for this year, because this is going to be a year-long operation, the Russians aren't going to finish this by the end of summer. They might be able to finish it by sometime in winter, maybe next year, maybe January, February. It's going to be a long time. It's going to take 6 months maybe. But it looks like what the Russians are going to focus on for the rest of this year is going to be focusing on taking Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and, have the front line basically kind of go like this. This will give the Russians major advantages. Because then they'll be able to start rolling up, because they'll have the high ground advantage from taking Chasiv Yar, and then they'll be able to roll up the secondary, kind of the main Ukrainian line of defense in Donbass, this Slavyansk-Toretsk line. Because before, since the Russians were coming from this way, the Ukrainians built this formidable defense line from Slavyansk to Toretsk that could hold off any Russian direct attacks. But attack from the back here is something they did not expect, and so it's going to be very hard to take off attack from the back, and they could just roll up. So maybe next year in 2025 they'll start trying to battle for Konstantinovka and Drustovka and start moving this way. This will also, as they move this way, this will allow them to start battles for Pokrovsk. And if and according to the Russians, with all these pushes, also, they're trying to push here towards Karakova. It looks like they're trying to probably try to seize Donbass by the end of 2025. That is, I think, the goal, is to get Donbass by 2025. So, the Russians activating in Toretsk kind of show, I think, even if it's like just trying to pin the Ukrainians down here, it shows that this is probably where the Russians are going to be focusing on for, and before I thought they would not even activate. I thought, I thought this was a possibility based on just attacking in Chasiv Yar and things like that. But I was not expecting that they would break through here, like attack directly, because I'm like, hey, this is a 2014 defense line, who knows. Anyway, besides taking Shumi, they have and taking this hill, a lot of sources are saying that they actually entered the village of Pishinia and entered the first few streets in this area, trying to secure a little bit of a bridgehead here. Just so when the Koreans counterattack, they might, they'll have some positions the Ukrainians can't just secure themselves along here. One thing is that the Ukrainians have this this higher elevated a hill here. They also have the stronghold here. So the Ukrainians could make a very good defense on the more western part. So I think the Russians aren't going to actually push through this way. I think the Russians are going to actually instead move towards the, kind of use this rail line as a defense and, try to secure themselves in Druzhkovka, Pashinya. And, I think this might help the Russians as they try to activate in the southern Chasiv Yar direction. Right now, they're trying to secure themselves along the Zerevsky Donbass Canal. But if they want to take Chasiv Yar itself, they need to basically do what they're doing in this micro-district, take the southern part, the northern part, and after that, they could squeeze the Ukrainians out of Chasiv Yar. But they have to do, and I think activating here in Shumi, they might not be able to take Toretsk, but they might be able to start, flanking Ukrainian positions in the south of the Chasiv Yar direction. One thing that's also is that they broke through, they took the village of Mayorska about a year or two ago. But the Russians have expanded through that, took this area right here, this, I think, pumping station they call it. And actually, a lot of sources are saying because of this breakthrough from here, and, they managed to go across the this rail line and enter Druzhkova and Pishiana in this direction here. And because of that, the Russians managed to start going up along the Zerevsky Donbass Canal. And a lot of tree lines that the Ukrainians had control over in this area are getting cleared. And so the Russians are trying to secure themselves here. And probably as they secure this area here, the Russians are going to try to advance towards, Druzhka, and probably try to maybe secure this village and have this be like push the front line from Gorlivka and start trying to attack the southern part of Chasiv Yar. So this is very interesting, the breakthrough here in the Toretsk direction. So we'll have to see. The Ukrainians are obviously going to, and again, this is the Ukrainians sent a bunch of their reserves in the Kharkov direction. How much more reserves do the Ukrainians have? I mean, I'm sure they have some, but it's a matter of, what's how many can they send here? How much troops did the Russians dedicate to this? Do the Russians just dedicate a little bit, and that if any reserves come, they could stop in their tracks? I mean, next week there might be no differences at all. There might be a huge advance, and then just it stops, which is what we see in a lot in this war. Is there's a major attack, and then it just goes into slow grinding. I do not think the Russians are going to continue trying to bog their heads along this area, because there's a lot of defenses here, but I do think the Russians might try to focus on battling for these two villages right here. So we'll see. So yeah, that's happening in the Toretsk direction. Now that since we talked about, let's talk about what's happening in the Chasiv Yar direction, because I think that's what this is one area the Russians want to take, and I think the Chasiv Yar can be taken by the end of the year. One thing to keep in mind here is actually a lot of the changes are happening in the northern direction. the battle for Kalinova is still ongoing. A lot of sources say that the Russians have taken Kalinova, at least the town itself, and that only the farms are under Ukrainian control, and that the Russians are still battling for it. But some sources are saying that the Ukrainian is like a gray zone, and both sides are going back and forth. Regardless, the Ukrainians are right in trying to prevent the Russians from securing themselves along Kalinova, but it is fair to say the Ukrainians aren't in Kalinova anymore. It's not like they have secure positions here. So the battle for Kalinova is still ongoing. The status of it is, we have, sometimes we get geolocated footage of Russians getting bombed here. Sometimes we see geolocated footage of Russians trying to bomb it. So it's a very big, back and forth type thing going on here. And the Ukrainians are going to have to, try to prevent the Russians from securing themselves here as much as possible. But, the Russians probably have a good chance of securing themselves in Kalinova. And, yeah. One thing that's of note here is that according to a lot of sources, that this hill has finally come under Russian control. And this basically secures their positions at Bogdanovka completely. This hill was the last. If this hill was under Ukrainian control, they could have the high ground advantage over Bogdanovka. But now that now that this hill has allegedly been captured, which is definitely possible, this secures Bogdanovka and its flank. And I have, the Russians probably also took this tree line. And the Ukrainians are probably in Gordelivka here, and along these tree lines and forests here, and in the village itself. And this is, they're trying to secure themselves and keep putting troops on these fields to help secure Kalinova. So the Russians, they're trying. There's this back and forth of the Ukrainians trying to secure Kalinova from the north, but as the Russians continue storming it from the east. So Battle of Kalinova is still ongoing. The battle for the micro-district is also still ongoing. The Ukrainians are still held up in the western part of the micro-district. The eastern part is under Russian control. And, maybe it's because it's a lot easier to supply here, and the Ukrainians don't want to, give the Russians a secure foothold here. So the Ukrainians are getting bombed in the western part of the micro district, but it's going to be very tough for the Russians to storm, it's taken a long time to storm this micro district, and they'll have to repeat this process in the center of Chasiv Yar. The Russians are already getting closer and closer, and one thing to note about this is that according to some sources, the Russians have taken the factory. So this area right here to the north of Vazhelusha Alana Street, that this factory's come under Russian control, and that the Russians are now trying to clear the fields between Kalinova and the micro district. However, if the Ukrainians are still battling for Kalinova, it's going to be very hard for the Russians to clear these forests. But it does make sense for the Russians to be entering these forests because the Ukrainians could then also supply Kalinova from the south, and if they don't try to disrupt Ukrainians trying to move troops to Kalinova from these forests, it's going to be very hard to continue to secure their gains in Kalinova. So I have no doubt that the battles for these forests are continuing. Some sources say these forests have been cleared, but I don't buy that, because if these forests are under mostly Russian control, then this canal, that's going to put the western part of the micro district in peril. But I do buy that this factory is probably under almost complete Russian control. So the micro-district is slowly getting eaten piece by piece. I have no doubt the battle for the northern forest is still ongoing, kind of like how the Russians cleared the forests to the west of Ivanovska here. So we shall see how as the Russians continue trying to reach the canal, this micro-district is giving them a bit of a headache, but yeah, so we'll have to see how this continues for the Russians will probably take the micro district. They will probably take Kalinova. But my question is, once they have themselves along the canal, the Ukrainians will then be in a bit of an advantage, because the Russians will have to cross the canal, and the Ukrainians could bomb any choke point that the Russians give. So it's going to be very hard for the Russians to secure themselves in. To continue their advance on Chasiv Yar, especially a frontal attack. So we'll have to see how the Russians deal with Chasiv Yar itself once they reach the Sovetski Donetsk Canal in full. But it's still going in Russian favor. The Russians are still on the offensive here, have the initiative, so but the Battle of Chasiv Yar is still ongoing. Speaking of the second part, the Donetsk direction, this is actually where the kind of the more where we get most of our updates this summer, and this week is pretty much no different. Still small advances, but again, in the context of this war, they're these are the advances we should expect. One of the biggest things is in the kind of the more northern direction of the Donetsk direction here, and is that let's talk about from the north here. So we talked about how the Russians have captured the village of Nova Alexandrivka last week. One thing the Russians are doing this week is that they are securing the flanks of Nova Alexandrivka. A lot of sources are saying the Russians are clearing this forest to the north here, that they stormed and captured these fields to the west of Arkhangelska, but to the east of Nova Alexandrivka. It looks like they are preparing themselves to start trying to cut off Kalinova from the west here, as they continue moving this way, and they're also securing themselves in the south. Securing these fields is very important because as they try to cut the Konstantinovka-Pokrovsk highway, they'll need to secure their gains here before they continue pushing towards Vozhedinivka here and reach the highway. Speaking of, a lot of sources are saying that the Russians have finished securing themselves in Nova Alexandrivka, are bombing heavily the village of Vozhedinivka here, and are apparently storming it as we speak. Like this Sunday is when they're storming it. So this is definitely possible. We'll have to see next week if that is true. If the Russians manage to make a foothold here, if they start battling for this village. But this village is the last thing they need to take before they can start putting this highway at least under fire control. But taking this village is a first step to if they want to continue putting physical control over this road. So Nova Alexandrivka, they've taken a lot of fields in the south and north of it, and they have fully secured themselves in this village. A lot of sources are also saying that they, this dam to the north here, people didn't know if it was under Russian control, if it was just the village, but most sources are now saying that this dam is actually under Russian control, that the Russians are in control of this area here, which it makes sense. So we shall, the battle, they have, taking Nova Alexandrivka is a springboard to continue their offensive to outflank Kalinova from the west, to continue towards the northwest, towards cutting the Konstantinovka-Pokrovsk highway, and then also attacking and securing continue pushing westwards to secure the flank of the forces trying to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, from Donetsk. So that's happening in Nova Alexandrivka. Another big thing is the storm of Sokil. The Battle of Sokil is almost coming to an end, and the reason why I say that is that one of the main strongholds of Sokil, you can see this strong trench network here has fallen, and the Russians have taken fully in control of this this trench network system, and so most sources are now saying that the Russians are, with the control of Nova Alexandrivka, they've been able to secure this tree line and take the eastern part of Sokil. The only thing that prevents the Russians from completely saying they control Sokil is that the Ukrainians continue sending kind of Bradleys to attack and harass Russian troops. So it's not like a secure position that the Russians have in Sokil. It's more like that the Ukrainians aren't in Sokil anymore, and they have retreated back to Voskok and Vinnyivka here. So I expect the Russians to continue pushing. I expect the Russians to try to, advance along this rail line, and try to advance, along Sokil, and try to secure themselves, more towards, and have the battle start for these two villages instead of Sokil. But with the fall of this major fortification in the north, this was a major headache for the Russians. But now that this has been taken, they can, continue now pushing the Ukrainians towards Vostok and Vinnyivka here. So the Sokil battle is coming to an end. The battle for these two villages is about to begin here, and that could be facilitated by the advancements in the north here. The Russians are securing themselves around Novoselivka-Pershi. They're bombing this place heavily. They're using a lot of drones to attack Ukrainians here. This is one of the biggest towns here. It's going to be, the Ukrainians don't want to lose it, but with the Russians advancing to the north of it, They are right on the outskirts of it from the east, and having success in the south from Umanska. It's basically, the pressure's on for Novoselivka Pershi. So no advancements so far this week, but the Russians have been bombing this place heavily. And, I think once the Russians secure themselves, in the north here a bit more here, clear these tree lines to the north, and probably once they clear Yasna Bronovka and manage to have the front line go something like this, they'll probably start storming Novoselivka Pershi. They just need to prep the groundwork for it a little bit. Speaking of the south of in the South Donetsk direction here, the battle for Yasna Bronovka is ongoing. I always wondered, like, what the hell's going on here? Why aren't the Russians securing themselves here? Because they need to secure themselves here in order to start flanking Novoselivka Pershi from the south. And this week, the Russians are doing that. The Russians are storming Yasna Bronovka. There is battles ongoing in the village itself. They haven't said the village has been fully secured, but if the Russians are in the village and storming it, then, I have no doubt that the Russians will secure themselves along this kind of reservoir right here. Just like, they secure themselves on the reservoir in Umanska. And, I have no doubt that the Russians will take Yasna Bronovka. This is getting facilitated by a Russian advance to the south here, to the west of Natalova. Now, we talked about like 2, 3, maybe a month ago that the Russians have finished their advancements and have secured themselves along this water reservoir to the west of Natalova. I said that they're not going to storm Karlovka. I think they're going to just secure their positions here, and the Russians will move towards the Karlovka reservoir to the north, and that's what's happening. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken the forests to the northwest of Natalova, and now the Russians are about to reach this final objective, because this is where the Russians want to be. They'll hold this position, and then, just like here, they're going to stop here and then start focusing on the north here as they try to clean up Novoselivka Pershi. So, the battle for Sokil is a prelude to try to take these two villages, which will allow the Russians to encircle Novoselivka Pershi from the north. And the battle for Yasna Bronovka and clearing this kind of small pocket here will allow the Russians to start offensive operations to put the more squeeze on Novoselivka Pershi from the south. And then from there, they could put great pressure from the north and south, advance from the north here, from the south, and, obviously from direct attacks, and then the Ukrainians will have to retreat to the west of this red line, retreat to these villages here. And I think that's where the Russians will stop, because, they'll start focusing more on the Toretsk direction here. So, that is where I think the Russians will go. But Novoselivka Pershi is the prize, and I think the Russians will try to want to take it by September or so. That's the Donetsk direction. Where should we go next? Let's go to the South Donetsk direction. In this area, Krasnogorivka, the battles for the Russians have started the battle for the residential area of Krasnogorivka. One thing this has, we have geolocated footage of Russian troops entering the residential area, mostly to this area right here, that we have sources that the Russians have entered this area, that there's some sources saying the Russians are here. So the Russians have entered the northern residential areas of Krasnogorivka. And so the battle for these small, since the Russians have control of the factory, of the high-rise buildings in the center of Krasnogorivka, the Russians should be able to take these residential areas a bit more easier than the center part. But, again, it's going to take time. It's not going to be a complete piece of cake. But the battle for, the Russians are now entering the northern part of Krasnogorivka. If the Russians continue pushing here and have more success in this area, then Ukrainian positions in the hospital and these last high-rise buildings will collapse, and the Russians will probably, have something like this. Everything kind of like this. They'll take the most of Krasnogorivka, and then they'll probably start trying to advance along, these fields and reach, because this is still also part of Krasnogorivka, but, and they need to take this in order to push the Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk here, because if they take, the main part of Krasnogorivka, they could take the main part of the city, but, Ukrainian artillery could still be here, and that could still shell Russian positions in Donetsk. So they need to push the Ukrainians away from here and have the front line go along the Vochachka River, and then the Ukrainian artillery will have to be a bit behind that, here, and then from here they won't be able to shell Donetsk anymore. But in order to do that, they need to clear these suburbs of Krasnogorivka. But clearing these suburbs will also allow the Russians to take Novolska, and kind of the main goal will probably be something like this. The Russians will, secure themselves here, and the Ukrainians will be, I don't know if it's possible to have a different color here. Yeah, there we go. Something like this. So this is where the front line will kind of be like. Yeah, so Krasnogorivka is, the Russians are now entering the residential areas, and we shall see how the Russians develop their offensive in that area. No further changes in this near Grigorivka. We got confirmation last week that this village has been taken. We shall see if the Russian. The one big question I have here is if the Russians have a small presence in the more eastern outskirts of Maskaly-Manovka here, and so if they do, then that means they could hold positions here, and that if they want to continue pushing on this village in the future, they have at least positions in the village itself. But if not, if the Russians got kicked out of here and had to retreat to Grigorivka, that's also a possibility. It's good to know. We'll have to wait to clarify the situation between Maskaly-Manovka and Grigorivka. In the more Ugledar direction, the battle to surround Konstantinovka is still ongoing. We got, the Russians are securing themselves in Perestolivka and trying to, secure their positions here. One of the more major movements is in the southern part of Konstantinovka. Again, the Russians are trying to, they've taken this tree line right here. They've advanced along this rail line and took this tree line right here. They are now advancing along this tree line right here. And so as you see, they're trying to push distance between Solika and trying to reach the highway, because cutting this highway would vastly complicate the defense between Ugledar and Konstantinovka, and also allow the Russians to start storming start putting the pressure on Konstantinovka. So the Russians are making small gains here, trying to do slowly encircle Konstantinovka. We know this whole song and dance. The Russians are doing it, but again, it's slow. We talked about how the Russians captured the village of Starmayorska. That has been confirmed because we saw footage this week of the Ukrainians storming, trying to counterattack Starmayorska and getting shelled near Marivka here. But those counterattacks seem to have failed, and the Russians are still in control of Starmayorska, and the Russians are still bombing Orozhaina. And I have no doubt that the Russians will start trying to put their foot once they have secured Starmayorska from Ukrainian counterattacks. They can start attacking Orozhaina. One thing in the Zaporozhia front is the Russians are still attacking in Robotyne. One thing we've seen is the Russians are advancing in these plantations here. We got geolocated footage of Russian troops here. And if that's the case, then, they are, again, trying to secure themselves in Robotyne was captured like a month or two ago. But, the Russian, they took the village, but the Ukrainians were still, in the they were still in the fields of it to the west, to the east of it. They were in the north of it. And so, it wasn't, if the Ukrainians wanted, they could do an attack and enter Robotyne if they wanted to, because it's not that secure. So the Russians are trying to stop that. They're trying to, secure Robotyne a bit better. And, so we shall see how that develops. I think the Russians are trying to reach this massive tree line, and then this will basically undo all the Ukrainian gains of the summer offensive. So the Russians are still trying to continuously improving their positions around Robotyne. No changes in the Kherson front. Let's go a bit to the north here. Let's talk about the Seversk direction. No big change. Actually, one of the biggest changes. This is like some breaking news type shit. It's the village of Rozdolovka. One thing that the village is getting stormed as we speak. We talked about how the Russians managed to enter the fields to the outskirts of Rozdolovka last week. But we got some sources are saying the Russians captured half this village. But we did get a video that, according to Russian sources, are Russian troops raising the flag. We haven't had that flag, that geolocated footage yet. But to some sort, if I had to understand, if they had that video and they said, "Hey, we took in half of Rozdolovka," in my mind, that means they probably raised the flag, probably here or something, and the Ukrainians are still probably in the northern part here. And So if that's the case, then Rosdolovka is about to fall. The Russians are in it. The Russians have the firepower advantage, and if the Russians are raising the flag, that means that you don't raise the flag while you're in active urban combat, especially for a small village, because you can't just like stop fighting. Like, hey, wait a minute, stop, guys. Let me raise this flag quickly. The Ukrainians will shoot you. So that means they're if they're very much comfortable just raising a flag nonchalantly, here. We don't know where it got geolocated footage. I'm just guessing, since they said they captured half of Rosdolovka. I'm pretty certain that Rosdolovka is going to fall, and we're going to get confirmation of that next week here. But the Russians have taken, a lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken the fields to the west of Rosdolovka. This allowed them to basically attack Rosdolovka and secure their positions here. And, if they could take, this area right here, they'll have the Bakhmuvka River as like a defense to the west here. And then they'll also have like these trees, they'll have some distance, between Rosdolovka and Ukrainian positions more further north where, where the Ukrainians are trying to stop them from reaching Seversk. So, taking Rosdolovka will be, the first main, is a good gain. They're pushing towards Seversk, but again, it's not like a big strategic victory. It's just a one step towards reaching Seversk. So, small. It is very significant. It's significant that they took a village, but not that much. We'll have to see the status of this village by the end of next week. So, but yeah, there are still battles going on in the Seversk direction. Nothing in Liman though. In the Kupiansk front, there are some sources saying the Russians moved a bit to the south of Vilishnina here, and trying to take positions along this kind of like area right here. So apparently some sources are saying the Russians are here. So according to the Syriac map that I use, so we shall see. If the Russians are going to, maybe they're trying to outflank Sinkovka, and once they cut off Sinkovka from the east here, they could maybe actually storm it and take the village finally. We'll see. Battles are still ongoing to try to encircle Stepanov-Selivka. There's some sources that are saying that the village of Pishana is now being stormed. A lot of sources showing Russian troops entering on the southern part of Pishana. So it looks like the Russians are actually trying to storm this village, which is actually pretty surprising. But if they have positions along Tavivka, then makes sense, because now that they took Berestova, they can storm Pishana from two directions here. And so, might as well take Pishana, because if they take Pishana, then there's nothing stopping them from reaching the Oskil River from this direction. We also are getting confirmation that the Russians are preparing to storm Stimaflika here, and that also makes sense. They have positions in the north, in the east, and the south, so they have all the preparations needed to storm it from three directions. So we shall see if the Russians activate and take this village. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the Kharkov direction. This is the direction where the Ukrainians have the initiative. In the Lipsy front, the Ukrainians are still doing massive counterattacks towards Globoka. A lot of sources are showing that there are Ukrainian troops on the tree line right outside Globoka. So, the Ukrainians are trying to enter Globoka. They have not taken it, but it is a goal of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are now battling for Globoka. So before, it was a battle for Lipsy. The Russians were trying to enter Lipsy, but now that is not, now the battle is for Globoka. And the Ukrainians are trying to, they've entered this tree line. They've entered the tree lines to the south of Globoka, and they are trying to basically storm it. So we shall see if the Russians manage to continue holding on to Globoka here. One thing of note in Lipsy is the Russians have used their Fab 3000s for the first time in Lipsy, probably striking Ukrainian concentrations. Again, if they want to attack Globoka, they need to concentrate troops, and when they concentrate troops, that's where they could get targeted, and that's what the Russians are using their big bombs in Lipsy. So to try to strike at Ukrainian concentration of forces as they try to attack Globoka. In the Volchansk direction, we actually have a lot of updates here. This is a bit back and forth. The Russians are in the initiative, but also on the Ukrainians. One thing is the Russians have taken the aggregate plant here. This taking this factory in the south, is a very will help the Russians put under control any Ukrainians trying to enter the citadel. So the Ukrainians might try to reach from the south of Vachansk and try to enter the citadel, which is getting under constant bombardment of the Russians, and this is where the Ukrainians are held up to prevent the Russians from taking northern Vachansk. But and they can continue resupplying them, but taking control of this aggregate factory, which is what the Russians did this week, will put a lot of pressure on the supply of Ukrainian troops in this area. But one thing is the Ukrainians are also on the initiative. We got confirmation that the Ukrainians are still in control of the village of Tivka, and that everything in this area is still not under Russian control. And so, and while the Ukrainians can't build up forces here to attack a track around here because they could get bombed to hell, this does prove that the Ukrainians have their flank secured here. So the Russians can't just try to outflank them from the east here. So the Ukrainian flanks are secured, but the Russian flanks are under stress here. But we shall see if the Ukrainians could gather troops here and launch an attack from the east here. Also, a lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians are counterattacking and trying to reach the village of Stariska, and the battle for this village is still ongoing. So, Russian sources are saying the village is still under full Russian control, but the Ukrainians are saying that they're battling for Stariska. So we shall see. So again, the Kharkov front is now on the Ukrainian. Now the only thing Russians could say is that they're pulling, because apparently there's only 10,000 troops here for the Russians and about 40,000 Ukrainian troops. That is enough for the Ukrainians to overwhelm the Russians, but that does draw a lot of Ukrainian troops in this direction, and this does really reinforce that so the only thing the Russians can do is say, hey, we're drawing a bunch of forces here, and these reserves might not be used for, like, say, Toretsk or in Chasiv Yar or in Donetsk. So the Russian troops now here are playing defensive and trying to basically hold as much Ukrainian troops as possible here. So that's the end of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly update. Hope you guys be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue seeing these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Give this video a thumbs up, share this video around, comment your thoughts, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wonder on.